The kingdom of Windar is in turmoil. King Henry still holds the crown, but his reign has long been contested by his sister Sabella, and there are many eager to flock to her banner. Internal conflict weakens Windar's defenses, drawing raiders, human and inhuman, across its borders. Terrifying portents abound, and dark spirits walk the land in broad daylight. Hello and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Hemvar, and today I'll be doing a spoiler-free review of Kate Elliott's King's Dragon. King's Dragon is a 1997 novel by Kate Elliott and book 1 of 7 in the Crown of Stars series. This is actually a reread for me. I read it first time in early 2021 between David Gemmell's Legend and Lois McMaster Bujold's The Curse of Chalion. This was shortly after I had finished reading Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, and that, seemed appropriate. But that was a good time for reading, and I read this, but I never really continued with the series, hence the reread, because now I want to continue with the series. This is a good comparison, though, this comparison to Tad Williams. The prologue starts off otherworldly, with people not human. They're kind of like elves. They're called elves, even, but they're also called the Lost Ones. It's kind of like the Romans as giants for the Anglo-Saxons, though there are also Romans as well, that they're not called Romans. And then it gives us a very Western, medieval, European-esque world. Elaine has, or Alan, I guess, if you wanted to make it not sound like a woman's name. French names often, it's hard to tell. Anyways, Elaine really has a French name, but he's a bastard and promised to the church. They say they're Carrier Elysions and Nonez and Compliance a thing, and then the Vikings show up, of course, right? It's essentially Lindisfarne all over, or maybe the Great Heathen Army, because it's not the first time these people have showed up, but this is fantasy version as well. So these Vikings are also not human, though they are humanoid. They're kind of scaly. The map for here also resembles Europe. The biggest difference, I think, would be the role of women being much broader in society than it actually was in the medieval period. And then these Viking creatures are also called Ica or Ika, something like that, probably Ica. Another world event is the brewing civil war between Henry and, the king and his sister Sabella. It vaguely reminds me of the Anarchy. Larger problems look on, seem to be on the horizon for the Kingdom of Windar and Vare, I'm not sure how they say it, beyond the rest of the continent of Novaria. Elliott invokes a great atmosphere. Like Tad Williams, it's not as beautiful in some ways, because I think Williams does a good job with his prose. It's easier to read, though. It's actually faster to read. It's very dark and otherworldly, though. It's also a very violent novel, right? It's dealing with war, rape, and slavery, and some people won't like that. That is very dark. Overall, it feels like 80s and 90s epic fantasy, what many would call classic fantasy, though I think that's too broad of a term for it. But at the same time, it's written by a woman, which I feel like we definitely get themes that the men seem to ignore or not focus on as much, at least with the popular epic fantasy from that time period. So Leoth and Elaine are our main characters. His secondary character in Rosvita. Elaine is destined to go to the Abbey until his town is raided. Start in the very beginning of the novel. Leoth grew up with her father and is constantly on the move, running from something. Her story involves astrology and how this kind of relates to magic. Her story gets tragic and dark very fast. The characters are small pieces in a game so far, and they don't get the most development, but you do feel for them. Even by some circumstances, they have pretty cruddy experiences. They're not nobility, so to speak, which is nice. It's a nice change of pace. Another point of view, of course, is Rosvita. She resides in a scriptorium, and her story becomes entwined with history and that in the making. There's very rich history and world building in this series, and it very much is slower paced, though I don't want the idea of it's slow paced that things aren't happening. It's not entertaining. I actually really enjoyed my rereading. I don't reread very much at all. But Rosvita does get involved with Prince Sanglant as well. And there's also a small portion for the character Hannah, who is largely tied to Leoth throughout the book. There's a character named Hugh who's central to the theme of abuse. This includes disassociation, where someone handles trauma as if it was done to someone else, right? And another character that's noteworthy is Agius. We get him with a theme of struggle that I found rather poignant. He's an outsider, like our protagonists, right? And it's because of his beliefs, right? He's a heretic. And I like heretics to a point, generally speaking. And he is one that has a great story arc. And then Antonia seems to kind of be a foil to him in some ways. But there's lots of characters. It's not an overwhelming amount, though. At least I didn't find it. So, also, there seems to be a very small argument for very early term abortion. It's kind of hard to tell, right? Which is a job well done by Elliott. I'm not actually sure what the argument is for or against, especially since the person that seems to be making it is a person you'll likely hate, and it's also a blink and you'll miss it. So don't feel like you're gonna get some modern politics you don't want in your novel. Well, I don't know. That stuff is always addressed well, I feel like, but it's nice when it is addressed well. So, but it's not, it's like, again, blink and you miss it. And then the Crown of Stars itself refers to a constellation. Heartseeker, also as kind of an aside, seems to be a common name for fantasy bows, if anyone knows what I'm talking about. But it does have very many epic fantasy tropes, but they're very well executed. It kind of reminds me of Bujold's Shards of Honor, which has a lot of space opera tropes, but it's handled very well. It's not boring, nor is it really slow. Of course, it's a little long, as much epic fantasy is, sadly. But it is cool that the author acknowledges things like Widukine's History of the Saxons and other more historical, like by historian books, basically. Along with the religion very obviously being medieval Christian influence or somewhat like modern Catholicism, though there's a lord and lady that are being venerated rather than just, one god. It's well researched and obviously messed with on purpose. And I like this more than, say, Guy Gavriel's false medieval world, as, this felt more fantastic and so had a better excuse for not being historical fantasy and not 100% historically accurate. Also, this lord and lady are called a singular god akin to the Christian Trinity. In relation to this, we have the descendants of women taking primogeniture in some aspects over those of men, because the maternity of someone is easier to track, of course. It also includes more realistic medieval army sizes and the way communication works over great distances at the time. The calendar even starts in spring like it did in later medieval England. It also has some obvious influence from Lord of the Rings, but those comparisons generally lead to disappointment, so I won't get your hopes up much here. But one obvious one is, the medieval Thanes, obviously, which Tolkien had as an inspiration for himself, but there's a chapter title called Shadows from the Past as well. And then Kinslaying is also similarly bad. See Tolkien's Elves, but also the idea of Weregild. So it's also low magic as well. I guess that's a term we'd use for it. Soft magic, even in that case too, though I hate the term hard magic. So, but we have a certain Lady of Battles. There's some fantasy creatures, of course, that are very otherworldly, and they get into this cosmology of things. And then saints have a fun role, of course. But otherwise, in large parts, it feels rather mundane, gritty in a way. The animals also play an active role, particularly dogs, which are largely terrifying, but also very nice. Maybe that's like the duality of dogs in real life. Rage and sorrow are a good pair of them. There is also the griva, which is a fancy French word for wyvern, essentially. Oh, and the biscups or bishops are essentially bishops. It's spelled SC. But I think that's like kind of cheeky of Elliott, as the SC combination in Old English made the present SH sound like sh. So bishop, though I'm sure most people read it as biscup or something like that. Maybe that's what Elliott intended. I'm not really sure. But it seemed like a cheeky nod, right? So I always pronounced it as bishop when I was reading it. And then, of course, we have also the Book of Shadows, which seems to be a term that I remember reading about in Wicca. So it's something kind of like a grimoire, but it shows up here as well. And the novel itself is divided into 2 parts. And each chapter, I think it's 2 parts. I should probably double check that, sorry. But each chapter has subchapters, and the whole thing is bookended by a prologue and epilogue. And fun fact, it was originally actually going to be called Dragon's Heart, as you can see on the front of The Golden Key, which Elliott was one of the co-authors for. That was as a forthcoming title. This was not out yet. And it was changed because of the release of the Dragon Heart movie. The old title, I think, would have been better. I can see why they changed it. King Dragon does work, though, as well. That being said, neither are phenomenal titles for this book, but, it is what it is. Anyways, I really enjoyed this reread, and I'm actually reading Prince of Dogs right now. So, anyways, Liam from Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.